Hello, everybody, and welcome to this month's Specifying Practice Group. Before we get started with what looks to be a pretty fun session by David Lewis, a couple housekeeping issues for everybody to remember. You may have saw the notice for this on a new community site. If you haven't, this is my first chance to formally let you know that it is now open to the general public. For those that don't know, CSI is in the middle of launching a new website, which is located at CSIresources.org. Feel free to go there, check out the new site as we start adding more content in the upcoming weeks and months, with the intent to think of it finally being fully live at the beginning of the next calendar year. So look for that. But with that, we do have online communities which allow for you to interact and engage, ask questions, post comments, view the recordings for this session, as well as other additional notes throughout the month and not just when we have our meetings. So feel free to check that out. I will again be posting a link to that also in the chat box, or simply go to CSIResources, all one word, .org, and look for the community section to go from there. With that, I do want to hand it over to David Lewis to get started with today's session. So David Lewis, over to you.
Hey, thanks very much, Matt, and thanks everyone for joining us today. We've got maybe a little bit of a departure with our program today because it's not entirely about specification. So we give Lewis credit for this brainchild today, so he's going to walk us through this presentation and share all of the tidbits that he's been picking up over the years running quality assurance reviews and managing quality requirements for his program. So, Lewis, how are you doing today?
So you're bailing out already and starting the excuses phase.
I am, because I'm suffering from jet lag, just having returned from Orlando, in the same time zone. So I'm going to use whatever excuse I can.
All right. Well, the photo here, of course, is Gary Cooper. And
I thought that was you without the beard.
And the reason we have him up here is that he is the patron saint of taciturnity, who made lots of money in movies saying, yep, nope, yes ma'am, thank you, and not much else. He's not known for lengthy, impassioned, wordy speeches like some of the other movie stars. So with that, we'll get started, because we're going to try to demonstrate that shorter notes are more effective than longer notes. And of course, we should be concerned about coordinating the notes from the drawings with the specifications, because ambiguous or unclear notes lead to unnecessary RFIs. And you can't get rid of all RFIs, but if we can hold them down to eliminate most of the unnecessary ones, we're much better off, because they come straight out of a profit margin. So,
well, I don't know about you, but I'm always shooting for 0 RFIs. We've got to be setting that goal wherever we can.
For that, but sometimes the contractors, bless their hearts, just have trouble understanding what's going on. So we're going to get some. Before when I came here 9 years ago, actually yesterday, to my present firm, and started to talk to folks about quality and productivity and one thing and another, I shocked some people by saying, we're not in the drawing business. We are in the information business, the business of creating, managing, organizing, and transmitting information. And so, to begin with, we're going to have a couple of slides here to talk about, well, what is information, and especially in respect to contract documents. And so I've put up a definition here that you can consider. But the whole purpose is to document design decisions that are non-physical. They're ideas in your head. And whether we do it with graphics or do it with the written word and the specifications, those thoughts originate with a person, and they always have a purpose. The purpose may be just storing the information for future use. It may be conveyed to a person for compliance. You may be, Matt, of course, is dealing with having a new puppy, and so he's going to be doing a lot of communicating with the dog in the next few weeks. And of course, sometimes we are communicating information to a machine, to a computer, to get it to tell us back what we want it to tell us.
So, and this comes back to you said that we're not in the drawing business because drawings are only one facet of what it is that we have to produce in the construction industry, because designers are always required to produce both drawings and specifications by contract so that we can clearly communicate the information and the ideas so that the contractor can actually understand.
Yes, and that's the whole purpose, because we have this idea in our minds, and to be able to turn that into real bricks, mortar, concrete, and steel requires rather elaborate and complicated information to be transmitted. And so that's what we're going to talk about. Dr. Verner Get.
Now this looks awfully complicated, Louis, and I surely hope that you're going to explain this whole thing, because that's a lot of words and a lot of arrows.
Well, very briefly, but Dr. Verner Get was formerly, he's retired now, the head of Department of Information Technology at the German Federal Institute of Physics and Technology, and he has developed what he calls the theory of universal information, which I own his second book. I'm reading, the first book is called In the Beginning Was Information. And we have, of course, here we have the sender and the receiver, and we have to make sure that there's the proper communication between them. So we have these different levels. Statistics has to do with the clarity and the completeness of message transmission. One of the first people to come up with, develop some sort of information theory was a man named Shannon, who was dealing with the problem of Morse code being transmitted across the then brand new transatlantic cable back in the 19th century. So in our case, well, we're going to show one example that's usually not too much of a problem. The next step up, cosyntix, is a word that Get invented. It's a combination of code plus syntax, and that is that, okay, we have these ideas in our head, and we have to put them into some sort of code form to transmit them to somebody else. As a matter of fact, right now, what I'm doing is I'm taking the ideas in my mind, and I am speaking English words to try to transmit those ideas, and I hope that everybody is understanding my words.
So those are commonly language, spoken word,
yes,
or written word, or the language of drawings, which is really symbology for the most part.
Exactly. So that when you see something that looks like a section through a storefront, and you see 4 lines coming up out of it, you know that that's insulating glass as opposed to monolithic glass, because it's a code. And we have developed various pochés for brick and stone and steel and even different metals that we've used over the years. Most of our audience, David, is probably not old enough to remember, in my youth anyway, at the back of magazines like Popular Science and Popular Mechanics, and in sometimes on matchbooks covers, there would be an advertisement for a correspondence school to teach people how to read blueprints, because it is a different language. And
when they were still really blueprints.
when they were still really blueprints.
So that is dating you, Louis, so be careful.
Well, actually, this summer I celebrated working in architects' offices for 50 years. My first job was in June of 1966. But even then, we were using blue line prints, and we weren't making blueprints anymore. But there were some old ones laying around the shop. The next step up. Now, the code and the syntax. The code, the words have to be spelled correctly, and the syntax means that they have to be arranged, for example, if they're words, in a sequence that makes grammatical sense. All right? Now, the next step up is semantics, and the semantics...
Before you go too much further, I just want to say that because of the syntax, it also requires some level of training, because you have to be able to comprehend the code.
Oh, yes.
Whether it's language or symbology on the drawing. So
yeah, because these are not necessarily intuitive things. These are agreed upon symbols. Like I say, when I'm talking about this subject to people, no one has ever seen a number. We have a numeral. For example, 3, the numeral 3, and we have a word 3 that represents the concept of threeness that exists in a metaphysical reality, but not a physical plane. Now, but we take these words, and there are rules for stringing the words together, and rules for creating words, but the next step up is semantics, because it is perfectly possible to write, for example, a sentence in English where all the words are used correctly and the grammar is correct, and it has no meaning. I will give you an example. This is from The Well-Tempered Sentence, a punctuation handbook for the innocent, the eager, and the doomed, by Karen Elizabeth Gordon, and has a number of very funny examples to illustrate the rules of punctuation. And one of her sample sentences is, if snow is wet, what is light? And of course, we all understand each of the words, we understand the sentence structure, but it has no meaning. And it is very possible to do that with drawing notes and even with the graphics, to draw things that actually have no real meaning to them. The next step up is that the semantics needs to communicate the expected action in such a way that the receiver, once they've received the signal, understood the code, determined the meaning, can perform that action. And so in contract documents, we're looking for the contractor to buy the right products, the Holy Four statements: hang it straight, screw it tight, beat to fit, paint to match. To accomplish, and all of those are ultimately aiming at the fifth level, the top level of apobetics, which is derived from the Greek word apobenon, meaning result, success, or conclusion. And this is the intended goal, the purpose that the sender wants to achieve, and all of the thought processes and actions on the part of the receiver that are required to achieve that goal.
Okay, so now, Louis, do we have to actually sit here and think about each one of these every time we construct a drawing note?
No, but I think it helps clarify our minds if we think about that these are different steps, and that there is a difference between applying a code and allocating meaning, because we can write meaningless sentences, meaningless notes, and we can draw meaningless lines, and we'll have at least a couple of examples of those a little bit later in our program. And the other thing is to keep in mind that all of this is to try to elicit the right action on the part of the person who is reading our drawings and specs, that they will say, oh yeah, I know what he wants, and do it, rather than sending an RFI and saying, what did you have in mind?
Sometimes it's easier to ask the question, and that could be part of the thing to keep in mind. So if we effectively communicate, then there's really no reason to ask the question. But if we're not effectively communicating, we're inviting question.
Yeah, and part of the communicating is, as we'll talk about, is getting the information in an expected place. And of course, that's one of the great things about CSI. But we'll get to that in just a minute. This is an example of the level 1 statistics. Did the message get through in readable form? And we see this all the time, and it's not someone went to the trouble to type in these information, these things, trying to communicate some information, but in fact the levels got mixed up, and they're hard to read. This is just one example. I'm sure you could find many of them, and it looks okay. You can read it now because it's blown up on my screen, but in real life, in real size, where that lettering is only 1/8 of an inch high, you can't read it.
Yes, but this is an example too. I think you mentioned Morse code earlier. If this were interference within the code, the receiver would never be able to make out the message. In our case too, because we can interpret what we're seeing, given time, we could probably figure out what the message was, but it would take that time and that interpretation, which may or may not be right.
Yes, exactly. And I don't know, but it seems to me, David, and maybe you can have a view on this, that it seems to me like I'm getting more of these interferences with documents produced by Revit than we did in the old days of traditional CAD.
And you would never see something like this in hand drafting.
No, that's one thing that we never had a problem with.
Right. So, and I believe you're right, because it's easy to rely on the machine or the software to develop the layout and place the text, but when you start combining things on a single sheet, then all of a sudden you get these kinds of instances that you do end up with conflict, unless somebody's really paying attention to be able to monitor what's actually showing up on the sheet and adjusting where needed. It's not always clear.
I did have a case, though, about 15 years ago at my previous firm, where the fellow had drawn had put a standard detail into the drawing sheet, one of our standard details, but he needed it opposite hand, so he just flipped it. The problem was all the notes were backwards.
And given time, you would have been able to read it.
Right. When I fussed at him about it, he said, well, I don't have time to check my work. I set him straight on that. Oh, bless his heart. He's not on the call today. So, our basic purposes. Of course, a primary goal is that drawings and specifications work together, that they're complementary and augment each other. And CSI formats have been a great benefit to the construction industry because they provide a system for creation and retrieval of complex information. because if you can't find the info, you ain't got it, and it's RFI time. I believe that most contractors will make a good faith effort to find a certain bit of information that they need to know, like what type of sealant to use at this location or whatever. But if they look at 3 or 4 sheets and look at the specs and spend more than about 3 minutes, it's RFI time. So it behooves us to know not only what to say to be technically correct, how to say it to communicate, but where to say it so that the contractor can interact with our documents very quickly and so forth. So here's the first 3 purposes. We have a second slide to identify components. That's the primary thing. And then a variation on that is identifying whole assemblies and identifying the overall R values of the assemblies.
And one of the things I would like to add to that, I think, Louis, is that consistency of where information is included is also really important, because if we start mixing and matching, if we start giving thicknesses or dimensions in the specifications for one item and then show it on the drawings for most other things, it's likely to be missed. The contractor is not going to know where to expect to find it in a specification if everything else of the same type is actually shown on the drawings. So I like to try to encourage the architects that we're working with, when I see those levels of inconsistency, to reconsider the kinds of notation that they're using. It's not just a matter of coordinating with the specification, but through the consistency allow the contractor to know where to find it. Because firm to firm, we see such disparity that I give the contractors a lot of credit for even being able to know where to look
Absolutely.
in the first place. But if within the same design team, at least we can be consistent. It's got to help everyone.
And an example of that is in Master Spec in the metal fabrication section. It has dimensions on how to build steel ladders, whether they're roof access ladders or elevator pit ladders, and the detail that may differ from the dimensions that are on the drawings. And so you have to make up your mind which one to do. So so that you don't have a contradiction. Anyway, so another basic purpose is to clarify things, because I wish people would draw details. Our buildings are more and more complex, and we just sometimes need to draw the details larger. And but from time to time we need to use some words to clarify what is difficult to see, and of course stating required actions and finishing requirements. Oops, that was a mistake. There we go. All right, so
this looks like a great example of some of the things where we may not want to do.
Yes. As we talked about earlier this year with Mike Chapp, one of the basic lean concepts is to track the value stream. And if a particular action or activity does not really add value, don't do it. So we have this note here in the upper left column, refer to structural. Well, the refer to structural is gratuitous, because for one thing, it's not even pointing to a piece of structural steel, and we haven't identified for the contractor what that material is. Is it painted chipboard? Is it plaster? Is it plastic laminate wood panel? And
And if that's a column taking up the same width as the refrigerator, this must be a monstrous building.
And then the whole point of the scheduled. Well, if it's scheduled, you'll look in the schedule. We're just trying to express to the contractor here, what these products are, so he can say, okay, base, wall base. I know where the wall base is specified, and we don't have to tell him that it's in a schedule someplace. This person obviously very, very much likes that word. And then, of course, we have the redundancy of CMU block, which is that's a good one. One of my least favorite notes that I run into is they'll point to a steel floor beam and say structural beam, see structural drawings. These things are not really.
And staying on the painted block,
yes.
I vote for anything that eliminates words, and if we can eliminate prepositional phrases, we're going to eliminate words. So rather than paint on CMU, it's painted CMU.
Yeah, I'll go for that.
Effectively communicates exactly what you need, and you may not even want to say painted on an elevation because you're probably calling out in a finish schedule somewhere.
A schedule, yes, because certain information like colors and applied finishes are usually in a schedule, not necessarily on an elevation. And of course, then we have the adjustable shelves in the base cabinets. Now, it makes sense to call out PLAM base cabinets because you might have some wood veneer cabinets elsewhere. But the adjustable shelves, of course, and the pools and things, those are all spec items and need not clutter our drawings. The point is that we can avoid a lot of waste. And this seems like nitpicky stuff. These are all little things. But they add up. You multiply this times 100 or 400 details and interior elevations, and you've got some significant time invested in something that is not advancing the project and not helping the contractor understand what it requires.
Okay, and you unknowingly are showing one of my other pet peeves, and I'll bring that up now.
Okay.
And others can just chastise me for this, but we're showing abbreviations here like PLAM and W/ for width. One of the biggest issues that we see difficulty with, and I just had this week, where the architect is going to include a list of abbreviations on his cover sheet, in effect, one of the front sheets of the drawing set. And nobody ever pays attention to this abbreviations list. So it's never consistent.
Least of all the drafters.
Well, yeah, it's never consistent with the drawing notes. So as we were going through the drawing set, trying to prepare the door schedule, we get to the door schedule and we find the door is listed with it's a wood door, listed with a finish STN. Now, we assume it's stain, meaning that it's a veneer door. We go back to the abbreviation schedule, and if we rely on the abbreviation schedule, that finish on the wood door is stone.
And speaking of finishes, Dave Metzger says that in this example, telling them to paint the block and not telling them to paint the column implies that there's a difference there.
Well, maybe the column is raw steel. It's the aesthetic look,
Right. Loft style. So, as I said earlier, we need to make sure that the notes, not only are they technically correct, they make sense if you read them, but they have to be in the right place. Now, this note was taken from an architectural wall section. And my question for the audience is, does anybody think that the mechanics who are installing the vapor retarder will see this note? The sub slab.
You mean they don't go searching through the entire drawing set to make certain that they find everything pertaining to the vapor retardant? Hey, that's why we're issuing PDF file sets, relying on search or seek and destroy, as I like to call it.
So bless their hearts, it's in the context, it's a meaningless note. And it does say that we need to make sure that our structural guys are putting an appropriate note and specifying the appropriate vapor barrier, but this is not the place to say it.
Right. And yes, we had one of our guests with us tonight, Mohammed Hakchui. I'm sorry if I mispronounced your name. Sorry. But he says the contractors would rarely even read that kind of a note. And probably the more appropriate note there is simply concrete or concrete slab.
Exactly. That's all we need to do is identify materials. And on wall sections, and again, this is an example taken from a wall section, and we have what I call over the river and through the woods kind of notes that it's a whole paragraph rather than identifying the individual components. But again, the basic purpose of a wall section, the primary purpose, I should say, are vertical dimensions, because you think of it as being a plan of the wall. The secondary purpose for a wall section is to have those nifty little bubbles that take us to the details, where we tell the contractor what materials are being used in those details.
Right, and these kinds of notations, especially on wall sections, I see this really quite often. You'll have an entire sheet of wall sections, and every wall section is essentially fully labeled with notes like this.
Oh yeah, and then repeated over and over.
Right. Well, you presume they are repeated. They may not be, and that's the difficulty.
We'll get to one of those examples in a minute.
Yes, because you change, in effect, create a situation where you're slowing down the contractor's comprehension of what you're trying to communicate. Because if something is so identically the same, note it once and label it as typical. Or what I like to suggest is let's pull it out and create an assembly drawing, label the one assembly drawing once, and then just refer to the assembly.
Yes,
which makes referencing so much easier and the comprehension easier.
Some of our people have started doing that with exterior wall types and roof types, if there's more than one roof, where they have a sheet that has details just for the basic constituent components of the wall, and then they can point to it and say wall type EX2 or whatever.
Right.
I think
this is a story in a note.
Yes,
right?
and I think a lot of these. You have to be able to
even understand how this wall assembly is being built to be able to understand this note, to know what exactly it even means. There's a lot of presumption here that the contractor is going to get this right.
Well, also I think that a lot of these are left over from schematic design, and some folks, because at schematic design we're not going to have the individual details for where the roof hits the wall and the coping detail and where the window heads and so forth, and so some practitioners will put these rather elaborate notes as a kind of a summary description of what the wall is. But once we start DDs and start drawing detailing, we really ought to kill all these notes, because many times the products change, and I've seen reviewed drawings, and I've reviewed drawings not only for myself, but I've done some peer review projects for other drawings prepared by other firms, is that there will be a difference between the notes that are on the small scale wall sections as opposed to the notes that are on the large scale details.
Okay. So one of our readers, Thomas Patterson, asked Lewis, how do you feel about keynoting to CSI members? Or CSI numbers, I'm sorry. I need to clean my glasses.
If we're going to do keynoting, I think I have mixed feelings about keynoting. For one thing, it made a lot more sense, I think, when we were drawing by hand, and writing all those notes was onerous. Obviously, the keynotes they work better if they make some kind of sense, that the note for sealant is 0792 something or other, rather than just being an arbitrary 147. That in terms of, because what we want to minimize is the contractor having to keep his one finger on that number and then take his or her other hand and run his finger down the list of keynotes to see, what does number 147 mean? Oh, medium modulus silicon.
Okay, so here's a question from John Hunt. As a roof consultant, when peer reviewing for an architect, does the architect appreciate identification of typos or schematic corrections? Because you were good enough in this example, Lewis, to give us at least one typo that I see. I have two of them now that I look at it, at least two.
Yep. Yeah, I did. I usually just circle them up. I don't make a note. I'm more concerned, on that insulation, the insulaton. Reversals are easy. That happens to people all the time. What I'm more concerned about is we'll see an example in a minute where they're using the wrong word. It's a homonym, and they've used the wrong word, and it looks ignorant. But that one, they're annoying, but it's still readable.
Right. Wrong words could be potentially a big problem.
But the wrong word could be RFI time, and we have an example about that. So, yeah, spell checker. Ron says spell check the notes. Well, of course, yes. Spell check is our friend. I don't know if Revit has that built in or not. I don't draw with Revit. And then we have the issue of duplicating specification requirements. Again, does this add value, or actually is it a problem? Because if our drawings are full of notes like this, is that going to encourage the contractor to read the specifications or discourage them? And I think the latter is the truth, is more the case. And if they do read the specs, these duplicate the information that are in the specs, and so it doesn't provide any value for that.
Well, and I think that when you end up with drawings that are sometimes dense with notes, that density can cause folks just to glaze over them and potentially miss some really important information.
Right. But again, I think when you have things like this, it's liable to, it doesn't encourage the contractor to crack open the spec book. I don't mind them grumbling about it and saying, oh goodness, what does he mean roof membrane? Okay, what kind of a roof membrane does he have in mind? To have to crack the book and say, oh, that's what he wants, as opposed to just reading something like this and going off half-cocked. And of course, number 5 is in deep error because the owner does not have a contract with the roof drain manufacturer and therefore cannot command that person, that entity, to do anything. So that's not legally enforceable, and it's bogus. Consistent, correct terminology. So, and here we have, so there's a big difference between caulking and sealing, and we sure don't want to point to anything on the outside of the building and call it caulking. And one of my favorite bête noirs is, that's kind of an oxymoron, isn't it, David?
Somewhat, yes.
Is brake metal, where we've used the wrong word. It's the tool that is used to form sheet metal, especially linear pieces, is called a brake, B-R-A-K-E. But in talking with some of our younger folks, they seem to think that brake metal is a type of metal, like copper or iron or some alloy, steel or whatever. So
maybe they think it's Zamac.
Zamac. Oh, that's a good metal. Does everybody know what a Zamac is?
That one would easily break. So, there we go.
So, what the contractor needs to know is, what is it? It's aluminum. It's 060 inch thick.
Well, and you have the comment at the bottom here saying that we can use the specs as the dictionary for the terminology on the drawings, and I think that that's true. We have actually gone to the extent for one particular client of embedding keynotes in the specifications and have developed some tools to automatically extract the list, which is then imported directly into Revit, so that the keynote list is coming directly from their master specifications, as opposed to somebody trying to manage that keynote list externally and paring it down to actually meet the project requirements. So there are all kinds of things, I think, out there that we can do to try to help this and correct and keep that terminology consistent.
But with one two-word phrase, brake metal, we've made three mistakes. One, it's the wrong word. Two, the brake forming is a specification item and need not be mentioned on the drawings. And three, it does not identify what the material is, so the contractor doesn't know what to buy, what to use in that particular location. And he pulls out his RFI pad and sends one off. And then there's the consistent terminology. How about that, David?
Hey, side by side, at least it was easy to find.
It was easy for me to find. I don't know why it was so hard for the writer to do that. Yes, and Ron has some other examples. Metal coping, steel coping, pre-finished coping. I always thought pre-finished metal was the stuff that hadn't been painted yet, but I guess I'm kind of a purist. I think that the precast concrete is the gray soupy stuff in the truck on the way to the job site. Mohammed points out font style, formatting, and spacing are important, and that is more at that first level of information, the statistics level. I worked
for legibility, certainly.
When I started out in this business in the 1960s, architectural graduates on the first day of work had to do a full 30 by 40 sheet of practice lettering, how well they could letter. And the guys that were, there weren't any ladies in those days, on those benighted days. The guys who couldn't letter well became field reps, CA specialists. One firm I worked for in Cincinnati, we did our lettering at a slant and used lowercase because you could save space that way. But it was still eminently readable, and it made the drawings look really cool. So.
You shouldn't be designing drawings. You should be designing buildings.
That's true. All right, I keep pushing the wrong buttons. And then there's the issue of people inserting manufacturer details. Oh, I want to go back to that previous one. In both cases, what is I've highlighted in yellow. In both cases, we're trying to tell the contractor what the item does rather than identifying. Our general rule is to identify the material, because does the contractor care whether if it's a water table or not? No. The only thing they care about is that it's architectural precast as opposed to cast stone or cut dimension stone. You could care less what it's actually doing in the wall. Now, we get this from time to time. I had a classic case, again, at my previous firm where the interior designer had detailed some reception desk and was pointing to the panel below the counter and referred to it as a modesty panel. Not a clue as to what it was made out of. I don't care what it does. I want to know what it's made out of. Okay, we can move on. So when we manufacturers in their details, they have to clarify what items they're supplying and what has to come from some other source, and they do that with the word or with the phrase by others. But when you plunk that into a contract document, legally, contractually, by others means not in contract. Now, I'm not saying that it will invariably be interpreted that way, but if we get a contractor that's a little behind and they're looking for things, that's one that can happen. And then there are other notes on those details that may restrict competition needlessly.
Yeah, and that instance of by others is not something limited only to manufacturer-provided details. We see it also happen between design disciplines. So
yes.
that electrical will identify something that is not in their scope. It may be plumbing or mechanical or even architectural, but they're labeling it as by others, just meaning that it's not under their control.
Okay. You want to read Dave Metzger's comment about keynoting?
Sure. About the earlier question, using CSI numbers for keynoting, of course, that was the concept for conduct. The problem I have with that is that it's too easy to reverse digits. For example, 08 35 13 folding doors versus 08 53 13 vinyl windows. Unless the specifier has dictatorial control over this type of keynote, it's too easy to make a mistake. I prefer alphanumeric keynotes related to a description of the item. Example would be WDW1 for for window 1.
Yeah, and that goes back to, is it intuitive enough that the contractor doesn't have to hold one finger on the detail and use the other finger to try to figure out what it means? That once they've read it a couple of times, it'll stick in their mind.
Yeah, this strict numbering keynoting is difficult, I think, and it takes time for folks to get used to the numbering and understand what exactly it means. And if you don't have the key to the numbering on each sheet, it makes it almost impossible.
Yes, and Scott says on the precast sill versus water table, we frequently detail and show enlarged elevations of each type so that identification in section might be useful. And that's true. There are, if you have, a type 1, precast trim type 1, precast trim type 2, that makes sense. But to simply call it a water table is not adding value or understanding for the contractor.
And Steve Laundrie, I think, is echoing something that you hinted at earlier, saying drawing notes sometimes get carried over from design development drawings unchanged into contract document drawings. Would it be better to separate DD specification notes from DD drawing notes, just as they should be in the contract documents? Steve.
He's anticipating my penultimate.
All I can say is, Steve, think preliminary project description. Let's get these these story notes off of the drawings and get them into a better document for managing it. And that way we can label the drawings very simply and control the description outside of the drawings.
So we come to the, I did a little brief introduction to Get's theory of universal information. We now have the Metcalfe theory of communications. And the shorter the message, the more likely it is to be read, the more likely it is to be understood, and the more likely it is to be complied with. And David
with deference to me's, less is best.
Yes, and he gave us a wonderful example of taking 6 words with getting rid of the prepositional phrases. We can get it down the same exact message in 3 words.
Right, and that's got to be our goal, because really the fewer the words, the less likely the misinterpretation, and it actually makes us think about what it is, what the message is that we're trying to communicate, and to be able to get it down to very succinct language, whether it's drawings or specifications.
So here's some tactical concepts that again we've talked about. The first bullet, what's really relevant to the type of drawing that you're doing. If you're drawing a plan, what notes are relevant? If you're drawing a detail or a section, what kinds of notes are relevant? The vague references, when I check a set of drawings, one of the first things I do is, when I'm going through just kind of familiarizing myself with the project, is I take a magenta, bright pink highlighter and I highlight each phrase, like C structural, C electrical, C mechanical, C architectural. And more times than not, it's a lie. It's bogus. The information ain't there. What those are notes for the person who's creating the information to say, that's not really my bailiwick. It belongs to structural.
Great way to pass the buck.
Passing the buck, yes. Identifying function does not add value. We talked about that. Avoiding proprietary terms. If you really want to irritate your local USG ceiling rep when they're showing you some new products, ask them if it's available in a tegular edge, because tegular is an ugly word, but it's a registered trademark of Armstrong for a rabbited edge.
Right. So we have a comment from Sheldon Wolf, and I think he said it aptly here. An attorney once told me, the more words you use, the more ammunition I have.
Says the king of the page-and-a-half spec section.
Yep.
Yep. You're getting some Gary Cooper talk in there, David. I like that.
Yes, sir.
And the next bullet, when starting DD phase, delete all those SD notes that are the over the river and through the woods paragraph type notes. If you can get away with it, have one person be responsible for the note vocabulary by marking up the first example drawings in DD phase. Mark up the first detail and then tell people to copy those notes. And then, of course, we all know when an action is required, start the note with a verb.
Yes, imperative mood. Do it.
Imperative mood, yes. So not only do we have moody teenagers, we have to have moody verbs. So there we are. Omit needless words. Omit needless notes. Okay, partner?
That should be all of our goals.
Well,
It will definitely be more clear.
yes, as
So
Joe
we
Kish,
came to the end of the hour, Lewis.
yes, as Joe
So-
Kish reminds us, clear, concise, complete,
Don't forget correct.
and correct. Right. Yes, I get
Okay.
tired of seeing folks who make up terminology rather than saying, "Oh, what's the right word for that?" and looking in our spec masters or looking at industry standard reference publication to find out what the right terminology is, and saying insulated glazing instead of insulated glazing instead of insulating glass. Just fingernails on the chalkboard time. Well, what are we going to talk about next month, David?
Well, I'm so glad you volunteered. We had planned a presentation, I think it was scheduled for this month originally, on copyrights. And Ashley Brandt, an attorney from Chicago, will be joining us next month, December 1st, to talk about copyrights as it applies to architectural documents. And we've given them a few suggestions. We've actually given them a few things that I have found over the years and some things that I've searched out on the internet as a starting point. So hopefully he'll give us some good guidance and some unofficial legal advice next month as to dealing with copyright. So we hope you all join us again December 1st, 3 o'clock Eastern Time. Look forward to seeing you then.
Yeah, a couple of things. We have had a couple of questions about will the presentation be available for download. David will make it into a PDF, send that to Matt folks at the at CSI, and you can get it through him. And Dan Clark in parting says, have you ever seen a drawing note pointing to a wall labeled masonry with 4 syllables instead of 3? I laughed so hard when I saw that from a set of existing drawings. That, yes, that's
In Philadelphia, quite common.
And Andrew Perez asked, is the session being recorded? Yes, it will. And it will be posted on YouTube within 2 or 3 working days. Well, so thank you everyone for your kind attention. Keep those cards and letters coming in for suggestions for future discussions, and we'll see you next month. We're planning to go ahead. The first Thursday is the 1st of December. We're planning to go ahead on that date, which will help us miss all of the wonderful, blessed holidays of the season. And we look forward to talking with you then.
Back to you, Matt.
Great. Well, thank you, David and Lewis, for another great session. As they did mention, today's session is recorded and will be posted to the YouTube channel. Again, that's youtube.com/CSIConstruction. That's all one word. That video should probably be there tomorrow. I'm thinking with a couple of emails that have popped into my inbox during today's session, I won't be able to get to it before the end of business today. So look for that there. Additionally, once I do get that copy of the PDF of these slides, I will make that along with a link to the video posted into that new CSIresources.org website that we are talking about under the specifying practice community. So look forward to seeing you all there. I know how many have joined prior to this meeting, so I'll see how many of you all come and join afterwards, and I look forward to talking to you online again before next session. Again, with that, thank you all, and we'll see you on December 1st. Bye, everyone.